Thank you for doing this.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
So, Sian Beilock, became president of Dartmouth in 2023, the first female president of Dartmouth. Before that, you were the president of Barnard College. And before that, you were the executive vice provost of the University of Chicago. And there's a Chicago thread through our conversation that we'll talk about as we get to this. She's also a cognitive scientist. And if you want to know why we choke when we do public speaking, go to a TED Talk that she gave that's now been widely viewed. And I'm going to ask you about your own experience. Have you ever choked?
Every day.
Every day. But first, I wanted to start with a bit of a recap for those of you in the United States and even outside the U.S., I think at other institutions of higher learning. Obviously, the past, since October 7th, has been a tumultuous time on many campuses, particularly the elite American universities. It's been a trying time for you and your fellow college presidents, university presidents. But you have actually navigated it in ways that some of your peers have not. And we'll get into what that was about. But just as a kind of recap, obviously the attack happens October 7th, the Hamas attack on Israel. Pretty soon after that, campus protests began in earnest. Campuses across the U.S. are convulsed with protests in favor of Palestinian rights. Almost 3,000 students ultimately were arrested across the United States, including, I think, almost 60 at your institution, Dartmouth. There was a very famous congressional hearing that occurred in December 2023, where the MIT president, Sally Kornbluth, the Penn president, Liz Maggel, Harvard's Claudine Gay, Columbia's Manoush Shafiq, all testified before Congress. Today, only Kornbluth remains a president of a university of that group. Were you approached to testify?
No.
Are you glad you didn't? Or would you have liked to have testified?
I'm always happy to speak to what I see as the power of higher education, and especially what happens in U.S. universities. But what I would talk about, and what I always talk about, is what our mission is. And our mission is as an educational institution. Our mission is not as a political institution. Our mission is not as a social activist institution. Our mission is to be centered so that we can allow different views on either side. So we teach students how to think, not what to think.
So take us back. I mean, you've been involved in university life for quite a while as a professor, as a student, then as a professor, and then as an administrator. How did we get to a point where we were, where there was this convulsion of protests that did threaten, in many ways, the ability of the institutions to do their job? How do you diagnose that?
I mean, I always go back to who holds the values of an institution, and at the most basic level, it's the faculty. And what happened on Dartmouth's campus after October 7th is that our faculty in Jewish studies and Middle Eastern studies came together in public to lead a dialogue and debate around the Middle East. And they modeled what it was like to have civil discourse. And I think that's such an important part of what students need to see on campus. They have to see different viewpoints. They have to understand how to have a dialogue, and they have to see the common humanity in each other.
So we'll get to a little bit more of how you see the role of students in this process. But to continue on the theme of the faculty, last December 10th, I believe, recommendations or new policy, the principles of institutional restraint were issued by a faculty-led advisory committee, as I believe, which very clearly seems to be a descendant of something called the Calvin Report from 1967, which was a product of the University of Chicago, which has been a leader in many ways in this area of the institution maintaining neutrality unless it directly affects that campus. did you convene that group of faculty or ask them to do that?
Yeah, my provost convened the group, and really the idea was, again, to be clear about what our mission is. And at its most basic level, going back to the fact that we're an educational institution, the idea is that as a president, I speak to our educational mission, but I don't speak to issues that might put the institution on one side or another that are unrelated to our mission, because that can quell the critics on our campus. And the Calvin Report, I think, said this best. The goal for a university is not to be the critic itself, but to allow those critics to foster. And it goes back to what we do. We create leaders and we create knowledge. And the way to do that, I believe the data are really clear, are to bring people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, different ideas to campus, and have them be an environment where they feel free to speak their mind. They feel free to push and debate each other. That doesn't mean robbing others of their free expression by shouting them down or setting up an encampment and declaring it for one ideology. But the goal is to create a space where people feel free expressing their views. And the idea is it's harder to do that if I'm taking a political position, or even my departments. My academic departments are taking a political position. And that's what I'm so proud about what we did at Dartmouth and our Dartmouth Principles of Institutional Restraint, is that they speak to what I do as a leader, but the faculty also espouse those views for the academic departments to which students and other faculty interact.
Is that policy, that institutional restraint, is that absolute? Is there a scenario you can envision in which you, as the president of Dartmouth, would need to make a statement on behalf, or the board would need to make a statement on behalf of the school about something that is not necessarily core to the mission of the school?
Yeah, institutional neutrality or restraint doesn't mean that an institution doesn't speak, but it means that it speaks and it tries to speak when it's relevant to our mission as an institution. And so I do think that is really important. I mean, it's not absolute. These are recommendations and policies. And the idea as a leader, though, is that I'm underscoring what we are there to do, which is to educate, to create academic excellence, to create the next generation of global leaders.
Now, your critics in the student body particularly have said that this idea of civility really is more of an attempt to quelch debate, that means limiting their ability to really make their voices heard on how they feel about what has happened in Gaza. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's exactly the opposite. Protest is fine, and it's a really important part of expression. Dialogue is great, I think, when you can talk to one another. But where we tend to draw the line is that when one person's free expression robs someone else. So you can protest, but you can't shout down a speaker. You can be outside telling me all the things you don't like. Even in our institutional restraint policy, we had a faculty dissenter who wrote a view that we published as well. But when one person's free expression robs someone else of their free expression, or the safety and security of my campus is put in jeopardy, where some students don't feel like they're safe on campus, that's when myself and my fellow university presidents have to be clear about, again, what the mission of universities are for. They are to educate, they are to bring people together, they are not to be political or social litmus tests for particular viewpoints.
Why do you think some of your peers, particularly in the Ivies, were reluctant to take forceful action in the ways that you did?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the decision-making process of my peers during those moments, but what I can say is that for Dartmouth, it goes back to what our North Star is. And I operate based on that North Star always, which is to find those students excelling in their environment across the globe, wherever that is, bring them to Dartmouth, create an environment where they can learn how to think, not what to think, and then go out and be leaders. And we follow that in everything we do. And I think that has allowed us to create the kinds of conditions where students think it's positive to push at each other rather than to shout each other down. And that's some of what I'm most proud of. We have a political union on our campus that's one of the only student-led bipartisan political unions in the United States, and they have modeled how to do this. In the fall, for example, they had Kellyanne Conway and Donna Brazile for a debate. We've had everyone from Mike Pence to Stacey Abrams to Anita Hill on campus. The whole idea is to bring different voices to campus so our students are exposed to different ideas and to create a culture where having a dialogue, seeing the common humanity in someone, even who you vehemently disagree with, is seen as really the beneficial thing to do. We talk about creating brave spaces rather than just safe spaces.
Earlier today, we heard from someone I'm sure you're familiar with, NYU professor Jonathan Haidt, the author of The Anxious Generation, who has, in his book and in his talk with us today, decried the inability of students today to really tolerate, much less engage in dissenting points of view. And he actually blames sort of social media for that. It allows us to hide. It doesn't teach us, our kids, how to engage with people face to face in some way. Is that something that you've seen? What do you attribute this lack of willingness to engage to?
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan is an expert more than I have, but I understand the data around social media, and I find it pretty compelling. But when it comes down to it, I think dialogue and learning how to engage is a skill that you can learn with practice. It's a muscle like anything else. And so we have a whole initiative at Dartmouth called Dartmouth Dialogues, where part of it involves teaching our students how to have this engagement and dialogue. So all of our first-year students coming in at the undergraduate level, many of our medical students, our business students, our engineering, are taking place and taking part in workshops where they're learning how to have conversations with folks that they hadn't spoken to before, to listen, to hear different points of view. And again, with social media, with technology, it's often easy to move away from that. We actually know a lot of people, our young people especially, are scared to make a phone call.
Right.
And the whole idea is that we are going to practice those skills. And I will say that it's not just young people that we know have a lack of ability to have those dialogues across difference. I think we've seen that on the political scale, both in the US and across the world.
So when you're thinking about student free speech, what is the line that you would draw? So, for example, if you had been on that congressional, in that hearing, what would have been your answer to the question that led to the undoing of three of your colleagues? Is chanting genocidal slogans a violation of your university's policies?
All of our students commit to principles of being at Dartmouth, and part of that is being in a community where you're not going after people based on their race or religion and spewing hate. And yes, we don't tolerate that kind of rhetoric on our campus.
So that would have led to disciplinary action potentially?
Potentially.
Yeah. Why do you think your colleagues had such a hard time answering that question in clear language?
Well, again, I wasn't there with them, and I think that oftentimes it's hard to think on your feet in the moment. My research shows that. But again, it comes back to principles where we're creating a community where our goal is to make sure no one feels unwelcome on our campus, and we don't tolerate discrimination based on race, religion, gender. That's not how you put the best educational environment together.
Were you watching the hearing, or did you see recaps of it?
Yes, I watched all 5 hours.
And what was your main takeaway from that?
Look, I mean, I came into the Ivy League with a cohort of women presidents. I think it was monumental. And mostly I'm sad to see my cohort not there anymore. I'm now, in my second year, the third longest serving Ivy president. And I think we have really a responsibility as leaders to tell the story of the great work that we do and to constantly work to recenter our institutions so different voices are there.
So as obviously everyone knows, we've just seen a new administration come into power. This president has said that this marks a great awakening of free speech. Do you detect any change sort of in the zeitgeist around what's permissible to say and what isn't now?
Well, every administration is new, and I don't think the administration changes what we do on campus. Again, going back to our mission, our goal is to allow for a diversity of views for free expression on campus, an environment where people feel safe, and we will continue to do that on our campus.
I will say that Dartmouth, I think, is the only Ivy League school that has not faced a federal investigation into civil rights violations around allegations of antisemitism or Islamophobia. And clearly you seem determined to keep it that way. Do you anticipate dealing with this administration any differently than you would have previous?
Look, I'm optimistic about the power of American higher education. I think that we have students from around the world that want to be at places like Dartmouth, and Dartmouth is really unique in that we're only one of 7 universities in the U.S. where we are need blind. We meet full financial need without loans for domestic and international students. And I'm excited to continue to work on educating students and producing discoveries that change the world. And I think that's something we do with all administrations, and we will continue to do it with this one.
But do you think that the student bodies today are different than when you were a graduate student or an undergrad?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, one thing we know certainly is through COVID, our young people who are ending their career on our college campus today had very different experiences. And we also know that in the US and across the world, there's higher levels of anxiety and depression among young people and lower levels of happiness. And so that's something we're actually really focused on at Dartmouth, mental health, because I really believe that in order to engage in those really challenging conversations, in order to put yourself in a brave and difficult environment, you have to feel okay about yourself and have the tools. We're producing the next generation of leaders for your workforce. We have to teach them to be resilient, to have conversations, to engage, to learn how to fail. And I think we as university leaders have a responsibility there.
Jonathan Haidt said people need to, the most important word he said for the audience earlier today was, I think, antifragility, to teach students that they're not fragile. I mean, there can be reasons why any individual student may be mentally fragile, but that in general, humans are far more resilient than maybe they give themselves credit for.
Yeah, I think we need to put young people in situations where they have the tools to face challenge and fail and get up. That's one of the reasons I'm so supportive of our athletes on campus. I think they experience that every day, and our students in the arts and other situations put themselves out there. And it's, again, about building this muscle of tools to be able to compete at the highest levels, whether it's on a playing field or in business or just having a conversation with someone who disagrees with you.
Is there enough ideological diversity on college campuses?
I think we have to be doing more to recenter our campuses. Dartmouth, we're really pushing at that, whether it's from the student body, whether it's from our faculty, whether it's from the speakers we bring on campus. But the whole idea, and I think the data are really clear, that when you get different people with different views and different ideologies pushing each other, you get to the best outcomes. So if our mission is knowledge creation, creating the next generation of leaders, backing up from that mission, we have to create that kind of diversity on our campus.
So let's just touch on one other form of diversity that seems to be under attack, which is racial diversity. In the wake of the Supreme Court's ending of race-conscious college admissions in 2023, in many schools, we've seen, in some cases, a fairly dramatic decline in Black and Hispanic students in particular. I don't think Dartmouth has really seen that.
Our diversity of our applicants was not different before or after the SCOTUS decision, and I believe we really use a holistic approach to looking at a student. And you can agree or disagree with the decision of the Supreme Court about affirmative action. Either of those are fine. But again, for us at Dartmouth, it goes back to this North Star to finding the students who are excelling wherever they are in their environment and bringing them to Dartmouth. And our admissions does that, I think, in a pretty remarkable way. They create a class that has different experiences, and whether that's your lived experience or your ideology or where you come from in the world, and that doesn't change depending on who's in office or whether or not students are allowed to indicate their race.
But is it important for universities to ensure a more diverse student body? Is that a responsibility that you have?
Diversity in all its forms, I think, are really important, and that comes from where you live, what you look like, your political viewpoint. All of that together, I think, is important, but our goal is to create a class that challenges each other and brings people together, and that means we look for the best and brightest across the world.
So I would imagine the spring sessions are about to begin at school?
We're on the quarter system, so we're in week 3 of winter already.
Right.
Yeah.
And what is the temperature like on campus now? Not physically, obviously.
It's very cold physically.
Colder than here, I think.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Really, I think, exciting. We had a great fall. Again, we had so many different speakers on campus, and our students are doing everything from enjoying our sense of place in the outdoors to having debates on campus and hearing different speakers. And I'm excited for what we're doing at Dartmouth and how we can continue to tell the story of the power of universities focused on educational outcomes and missions first and foremost.
President Beilock, thank you so much for joining us.